Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Some Stops Along the Way. We've got a profoundly interesting episode today highlighting the countries of Serbia and Montenegro. And we're going to jump into that here in just a few moments. But first, we want to do a little bit of business. We want to make some connection to the last episode that we did on Kosovo. And I've got some interesting resources for you this morning that you might want to check out. First of all, a couple books that I really recommend about Kosovo. One by Noel Malcolm, which is called Kosovo: A Short History. Again, it's an easy read. It really leads you through the history of that very interesting and profoundly intriguing country. It's a history that is littered with tragedy, but also there's a lot of triumph woven in there as well. And I think Noel Malcolm tells the story very well. If you want to know more about the war years in Kosovo during the 1990s, there's a very good book by Matthew McAllister called Beyond the Mountains of the Damned, The War Inside Kosovo. This book is, I think, as objective as it can be in analyzing what occurred during the war in Kosovo. It deals with not just the reasons that the war occurred, some of which we discussed on our last episode, but it also really talks about the effects of that war and the genocide that was perpetuated during that time, the aftermath of that genocide, and how it's affected Kosovo even today. So check out Matthew McAllister, Beyond the Mountains of the Damned, The War Inside Kosovo. You can get both of those on Amazon. Speaking of books that you can get on Amazon, you can also get my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, on which this podcast is based. The book has a lot more personal stories. It has a lot more context than we go into on the podcast. I hope you'll grab your copy on Amazon. Some Stops Along the Way, my memoirs. So let's jump into a discussion of a couple of countries today. And by the way, I hope you like my new microphone. Say hello to my little friend, as it says. So we'll see how it works, and I'm trying to go a little bit more upscale on the podcast, I guess, and get a cool microphone like everybody else has. So I hope you enjoy that. Anyway, Serbia and Montenegro. Let's talk a little bit about them. When I first traveled to Montenegro in the early 2000s, it was not yet its own country. It was still very much tied to Serbia. The Montenegrins didn't vote for independence until 2006. And so my early work there with NGOs, civil society organizations, business associations, on public policy advocacy and the creation of an organization that still exists to this day, the Montenegro Business Council, was prior to Montenegro becoming its own country, so to speak. I remember the getting ready to fly in there. I was told to go to the Vienna airport and wait for someone to come and set up a kiosk where I could buy a ticket to Podgorica, which was the capital of Montenegro. Well, interestingly enough, I had just finished a project in Indonesia. And the weather in Indonesia obviously was very much different than in Vienna and in Montenegro. And so I arrived in Vienna wearing an Indonesian batik shirt and very much looked like that I was not in the right place. Let's say that. And so I went to the airport. I sat forlornly waiting for someone to set up this kiosk. I'd never been in a situation where I had to wait for someone to set up a kiosk before, but literally about an hour and a half before the flight was to take place, a guy comes out, he sets up this kiosk, he stands there and announces that the flight to Podgorica, Montenegro. So I sorted out the details, got my ticket, and flew to Podgorica for the very first time, not knowing what to expect at all. So once I got to Podgorica, I met someone who became a very good friend of mine and is so to this day, Petar Ivanovic. Petar is an interesting individual. At that time, he ran a major think tank in Montenegro, very respected member of the business community. But since that time, he's gone on to do some really interesting things. He still is very much involved in the intelligentsia, if you will, of this small country of Montenegro. But he also became chief economic advisor to the prime minister. For about 7 years, he was CEO of the Montenegrin Investment Promotion Agency. After that, he was Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development for several years, almost 5 years. Then he was Deputy Prime Minister for a few months, and even to this day is a member of the Parliament chairing the Agriculture, Tourism and Spatial Planning committees. At that time, Petar was really a star, not only in that country, but in that region, as far as driving reforms. And as I said, he's continued so even to this day. So we went from the small airport there, me still in my batik shirt from Indonesia, Petar and my colleague that I was working with there, Malcolm Tolan, immediately when they saw me in the airport, they knew it was me, number one. But also, they immediately said, "Did you lose a bet? What happened? Well, what's the deal with the shirt?" And so everyone in the airport was a little bit curious about this guy that shows up looking like he just walked off of a beach in Bali, in showing up in Podgorica, Montenegro. But at any rate, we left the airport, went into the city, went to Petar's office, and met another person who was going to be very integral to my time, not just in Montenegro, but really throughout the countries that I worked in the Balkans later on. And her name was Yelena. And Yelena was a very bright graduate student of economics and served as our fixer and our interpreter during my time in Montenegro. So after getting oriented, we really began to talk about the business climate of Montenegro, what we were there to do, and especially the creation of this Montenegro Business Alliance. But before we could do any of that, we needed to build the capacity of the business community and the NGO and Chamber of Commerce leaders in Montenegro to be able to better understand public policy advocacy, how they could have substantial conversations with the government, and how they could help drive reforms, even in this period prior to the independence of Montenegro, which happened in 2006. And so we began traveling around the country. I remember that first day in Podgorica. It was still quite a fluid place at that time because it was not yet a country, and because of its attachment to Serbia. It was a very interesting time and a somewhat lawless time in Montenegro during that period. I remember a sign I saw in a shop window that said, "Welcome to Podgorica. Your car is already here," because they were famous for cars being stolen throughout Western Europe and ending up in Podgorica to be resold and driven throughout the country and throughout the region. And that was indicative of the types of things that were going on at that time, because the rule of law had not yet caught up with the reforms that were being put in place. So we began to travel around the country, and we had a driver named Veso. I'll never forget Veso. He was a very cool guy. I mean, this guy was so cool that he could walk into a room and the temperature would drop. Very, very cool guy. I would say probably late 40s, early 50s. And he, number one, drove as fast as he wanted to drive. If any policeman tried to wave him down, he wouldn't even slow down, and he would actually, on a couple of occasions, gave them the finger as he went by, almost daring them to stop him, and they never did. But Veso loved to play his music loud. He chain smoked, but was a great guy and one who really made me laugh and taught me a lot during the time that I worked there. So Yelena, Malcolm, and I were really the three amigos who traveled around Montenegro and attempted to build the capacity of organizations throughout the country. We went to some phenomenal places there, like Budva, a beautiful ancient town on the Adriatic Sea. Herceg-Novi, another beautiful coastal town. And Kotor, a very historic town with an ancient wall that's actually built around it. And it's that wall that became a subject of discussion that really taught me something about the Serbian mindset and the Montenegrin mindset. And realizing that a majority of Montenegrins are of Serbian descent. We were standing in Kotor one day, and we were discussing with the city leaders about the history of the town. And I noted the wall surrounding the city, and I joked, I see the ancient wall still exists that you built to keep the Turks from invading during the Ottoman years. And Yelena, in English, laughs and says to me, "No, you don't understand. We didn't build the wall to keep the Ottomans from invading us. They built the wall to keep us from invading them." That's totally a Serbian mindset. Another day when we were sitting in Herceg-Novi talking to a Montenegrin, he told me a joke that I'm going to share with you now that I think is also indicative of this whole nationalistic approach within the region. Here's the joke. 3 astronauts land on the moon. The rocket lands, and there's an American, there's a German, and there are 2 Serbs on the rocket. So they land on the moon, door opens, and as this joke was relayed to me by the Montenegrin Serb in Herceg-Novi, he said, of course, the American pushes his way ahead, jumps out, steps on the moon first, and said, "I'm the first person to step on the moon, and so I plant this flag and claim it for the United States of America." And he plants the flag. Well, the German astronaut is standing behind him and says, whoa, wait a minute. You may be the first person on the moon, but the Germans provided the technology for you to build the rocket to get here. So I'm claiming the moon for Germany, and he plants the German flag. So the 2 Serbian guys are standing there, the astronauts, and they look at each other for a moment. Then one of them pulls out a gun and shoots the other one in the head. and says Serbian blood has been spilled on the moon. It's ours forever. And I would never have told that joke on my own. I was told it by a Serb himself. And it's indicative of the nationalistic view, the world view that they have. They're a very proud people. And that's why you can't really talk about Montenegro without also talking about Serbia. And that's what we're going to do today. And you'll see a little bit when I get into the history of each country, how this mindset really came to be. It's profoundly interesting how these nationalistic tendencies grew in the region, and also how they laid the foundation for a great deal of conflict throughout the Balkans, and especially for the periods of wars in the 1990 after Slobodan Milosevic became ruler of Serbia. But I will say that my time in Montenegro was just a fantastic early period in my development as an international development executive. I learned a great deal there. I learned a great deal about not only the history of the region, but also about how the economy worked in the region, how the politics of working in the region, etc. And it was very interesting also to work in an area that was not yet its own country, as Kosovo had not been when I first worked there as well. And because this added a layer of complexity that we had to deal with in our day-to-day work. So Yelena and I traveled all through the country, as I said, and we did the work there, and which eventually led to the formation of the Montenegro Business Council, which is still a strong organization to this day, and I think played a very key role in the country's economic development after its vote for independence. And Yelena also met me in Serbia for the work that I did there. And we were together in other places in the Balkans as well, doing the same type of projects. So we developed a relationship over time. But one thing I'll relay in the book that I will never really forget, and something quite frankly that if I could go back and redo, I would do so. Elena and I were in Belgrade, and one evening we went out to dinner near a place called Kalemegdan Fortress, which is a ancient fortress there in Belgrade. It has a lot of restaurants around it. It's near the river. So we went down to one of the restaurants near the river, and we sat, had a drink, and had dinner, and we began to talk. And it had been a while since I had seen her. And so we were talking together, and of course the conversation led to regional geopolitical events. And I asked her, what's your view on what's going on now between Serbia and other countries in the region? And I'll never forget it. She paused for a moment. She put down her fork. She looked at me and said, you know, that's the first time you've ever asked me my opinion? I said, what are you talking about? We've done several projects together, and we've known each other for a while. And she said, I understand that, but this is the first time you ever asked for my opinion on what's going on in this region, or my opinion really on anything. You looked at me as an interpreter, and I sat through meetings where you ask everybody their opinion. That young woman in Kosovo, Shefya, Professor Mustafa, our colleagues and friends in Montenegro. You gain input from so many people. And that's to your credit, because that's one of your strengths, is that you seek to understand. But you never, through all of that, through all the drives that we made together, through all the travel that we did, you never asked for my opinion. And I thought back, sitting there, and I realized that she was right. That the person who I valued probably the most of anyone that I worked with in that region during those years, the person who sat beside me in the backseat of Esso's car driving around Montenegro, the person who met me in Belgrade and went with me to Pančevo to do our work there with the NGOs and CSOs and business community. The person who was intelligent and articulate and well studied and knew a great deal about the geopolitical context of the region, I hadn't considered her opinion at all. And that really cut me to the quick. It really made me think. And I apologize. I said, Yelena, I'm so sorry. I really am profoundly sorry that I didn't ask your input. And she said, it's fine. But I knew it wasn't fine. And we finished our meal and we walked back through the fortress and down to my hotel. And as we stood there on the street, she gave me a hug. I hugged her and I started to pull away, and she held on. And finally, when she let me go, I looked at her and I realized that her eyes were glistening. And it was at that time that I realized how profoundly I had hurt her by not considering her point of view. And even though I'd apologized, it was something that never should have happened, because I prided myself on gaining input. It was a wake-up call for me. It's something I tried never to repeat, but I wanted to share it with you, because there are so many times, I think, when we seek to understand something, or possibly when we develop an idea about something, an opinion about something, a point of view, and we tend to talk to those who agree with our point of view. We tend to talk with those who will reinforce our position, instead of those who may disagree or may have a different perspective, but that will add value to our overall approach or our overall understanding. Once I started talking to a few contacts on each side, the Serbian side, the Montenegrin side, I had enough hubris at that time, because I was much younger than I am now, to think, okay, I understand this. And I went about my business. And it worked. We did a lot of great work there. But what I found was that the person who was closest to me during that time is the person I overlooked. I considered everybody's point of view except that person who was with me every day. There's a study of human nature there. And I can't say that I've never repeated that mistake, although I've consciously tried not to. And certainly in my work, I've tried not to. So, all the work that I did in Montenegro and Serbia, really, the success of that work was based on understanding the context of those profoundly interesting countries. And I want to share some of that context with you. Let's start with Montenegro, this small country on the shores of the Adriatic Sea, a fascinating country. You can ski in the morning in Montenegro and go to the beach in the afternoon. It has a very Mediterranean climate. The food is very Mediterranean. And yet it has a lot of Ottoman influence as well. It is outside of Podgorica, which is not the most interesting capital city that I've ever visited. Outside of that, these communities of Kotar, Herceg-Novi, Budva that I talked about are just fantastic. Not only are they beautiful, but their history and their culture are so profound. And at that time, it was very inexpensive to go there. Montenegro to this day is a relatively inexpensive place to go. And that's why it's becoming a hot tourist destination now, because you get everything. You get the total package. If you want to go to the mountains, you can do that. If you want to go to the beach, you can do that. If you want to be immersed in history, you can do that. If you want great food, you have it. Just an amazing place. But all of that ties back to its own history. You know, while Montenegro's origins are ancient, the term Montenegro was first used in reference to the country in the late 15th century. In the 16th century, Montenegro fell under Ottoman control until 1696, when it gained semi-autonomy and really became at that time more of a theocracy, and then later on a principality. And then, of course, World War I came, and in 1918 Montenegro became part of Yugoslavia until its breakup in 1992. During World War II, Montenegrin communists led what was one of the first uprisings against Nazi occupiers on July 13, 1941, shortly after the region had been occupied. And Montenegro was liberated by partisans in December of 1944. After the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Montenegro and Serbia formed a federation that lasted until 2006. Now remember, the dissolution of Yugoslavia came in 1992, when really, if you remember from our last episode on Kosovo, once the strongman who had ruled Montenegro since the post-war years through 1980, Josip Broz Tito, passed away. After that, there's a series of power plays by different politicians in the region, which led eventually to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And after the dissolution, rather than becoming an independent country as others did, Montenegro and Serbia formed a federation. And this lasted until 2006, when Montenegro declared its independence through a referendum. Though a small country, Montenegro is middle income. It has a service-based economy. It's a member of a number of international organizations, and it's been actively pursuing membership in the European Union since 2012. It also became a member of NATO in 2017, which was a huge step in its development. The country is primarily Eastern Orthodox Christianity. About 71% of Montenegrins are Eastern Orthodox, while Muslims comprise 19% or so of the population. The history of Montenegro cannot be told without discussing the Ottomans, or the Turks, who invaded that region and whose culture still is important in that region and in Montenegro today. You'll still see a lot of Ottoman-styled buildings in the country. You will see the Ottoman influence in their food to a certain degree. And you will still see, of course, Ottoman influence in terms of mosque and the Muslim influence in the country, albeit in the minority. So as far as Serbia goes, a little bit about its history. The first signs of life in Serbia's capital, Belgrade, date back to around 6500 BC during the Neolithic culture. The Romans conquered much of what is now Serbia during the 2nd century BC, but by 395 AD, the Roman Empire fragmented and most of modern-day Serbia was incorporated into what was then known, or what is now known, as the Byzantine Empire. By the 6th century, Slavic peoples migrated to the region in large numbers, intermarried with the Romans, and that was really the foundation stone, if you will, of the Slavic presence throughout the region. Serbia continued to gain prominence, but in 1371 it fragmented into several principalities due to an ongoing threat from the Ottomans. But beginning in 1688, the Habsburg monarchy fought against the Ottomans for control of the region, and by 1718, the Habsburgs controlled most of what is central Serbia. However, the Ottomans didn't just go away. They still controlled parts of Serbia all the way through February 15th, 1835, when the country adopted its first constitution. A watershed moment in Serbia's modern history is when a Serbian national, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1994, which immediately led to Hungary declaring war against Serbia, and that laid the foundation for, at that time, what was the greatest and most debilitating war in history, World War I. At the end of World War I, Serbia became part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then later on, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia from 1944 until its dissolution, as I said, in 1992. Even when Yugoslavia dissolved into independent states, however, Serbia continued to hold vast influence over Montenegro and of course, over Kosovo as well, and throughout the region, given its size, given its population, and given its political construct. Another seminal moment came for Serbia in 1989 when Slobodan Milosevic gained power. We talked about Slobodan Milosevic during the episode on Kosovo. He played on Serbia's nationalistic leanings, and this really laid the foundation for the numerous wars that occurred in the region in the 1990s. Now, Montenegro didn't have the kind of debilitating war that occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and even to a smaller degree in Croatia. The Montenegrins, being primarily Serb, were, if not supportive, at least more neutral in their stance and more conciliatory towards Serbia. And so the debilitating wars of the 1990s didn't reach them to a large degree. But I can tell you that since the time that I worked there, Montenegro has become an example in the region of how a country can really change its destiny. First, from part of a larger country, Yugoslavia, and then as a principality of another country, Serbia, and then as a small nation who needed a lot of support in the beginning and had a lot of issues with organized crime and other social ills, but it's managed to work its way through that until now it is a country that is emerging not only as a tourist destination, but as a country that has a lot going on in terms of its economy and a fairly stable political environment. Certainly, problems remain, challenges remain, because it's in a difficult neighborhood. But it has emerged as one of the leaders in that area. When you look at the struggles that Kosovo is still having, and you look at the struggles that Bosnia and Herzegovina are still having, certainly it is ahead of the game in terms of its development. You look at other former Yugoslav countries like Latvia and Croatia. They're very much like Montenegro, where they've been able to move on and really create the kind of society and the kind of economy that is growing. And of course, just across the Adriatic Sea from Montenegro is Italy. And so there's a lot of Italian influence in Montenegro as well. And Italy's very accessible there. And Montenegro tends to be somewhat less expensive than Italy, so you can have the greatest of all worlds, if you will, in Montenegro. Relatively stable country, as I said, great food, the beach, the mountains, the history, pretty fantastic place. Serbia, on the other hand, is a large country. It's a profoundly interesting country. It's a country that is, I think, misunderstood a lot of times. Certainly, the Serbian people are very nationalistic. They're very proud people. But they are not, in my experience, mean people. They're not people who are disrespectful of others, but they're very protective of their legacy. And anything that attacks that legacy, even to this day, becomes a problem. And that's why Milosevic was so successful there in promulgating his worldview and in creating the angst that happened in the 1990s, is because he played on those nationalistic tendencies. And he drove those nationalistic tendencies to almost an absurd degree. I remember when I was working in Serbia, I was in a town of Pančevo, which is just outside of Belgrade. And I was talking to some business leaders there, and one of them told me, he said, "Look, Mark, there's been a misunderstanding here, okay? People think that all the Serbians were lined up behind Milosevic and that we were just, we hated everyone and that we wanted to exterminate all these people groups and that we had such nationalistic tendencies that we embraced the genocide that happened in this region." And he said, "It's just not the case." He said, "My friends and I, we didn't respect Milosevic at all. We wanted him out as badly as anybody. And as a matter of fact," he said, "I and my friends were in the crowd that actually broke into the Parliament building in Milosevic's last days. And were throwing papers out the window and throwing furniture off the balcony." He said, "I'm not proud of that. It was pretty juvenile. But we saw the end there. We saw the momentum moving in the direction of getting rid of this guy who had brought so much calamity, not just to the region, but to our own country. We were being bombed by NATO, and especially the Americans, on virtually a daily basis. Our quality of life was under attack because this person, Milosevic, had driven his agenda to the point where all Serbs were now suffering, those within Serbia itself and those outside of Serbia that were painted with the same brush as Milosevic. And he relayed to me a quite an interesting and funny story. He said toward the last days, he said, when we really decided that Milosevic had to go, he said, we were all talking about it. But he said, we're in church one Sunday, and the air raid sirens go off. And we know the NATO planes, probably American planes, are in the air, they're bombing. And typically they were bombing military targets. And so we weren't overly concerned at that time because they were very good at their jobs. And most likely we weren't under any threat because we weren't close to military installations. But then we heard an explosion very close. It was within blocks of the church. It shook everything. And I looked at my friends who were also there with their families. And we're thinking, what could that be? There's no military installation around here. There's only and then the worst possible thought entered our minds. Oh, no. And literally, my friends and I ran out of the church in the middle of the service. We jumped in our cars. We drove down to the beer factory. We had a beer factory in Pančevo that had been there for many years. It made great beer that was sold all over the region, and the place is on fire. The Americans had bombed the beer factory. And right then we knew, look, we can tolerate a lot of things. Okay, we can tolerate being the pariahs of the region. We can talk about governments saying bad things about us and putting in sanctions in place. But they bombed our beer factory. This was, as silly as the example was, it was indicative of how Serbian society at that time was really under attack itself because of Milosevic and his henchmen. And he said, right then, we made the decision, we're going to Belgrade, and this guy's got to go. So he joined the student protests, and eventually it led to him being pushed out. Today, Serbia is still at odds with itself, I would say. I've walked large parts of that city, stood at Kalemegdan Fortress, interacted with a lot of good friends there. Belgrade itself is a modern city. It's a city with a lot of amenities. They love basketball. They love the NBA. It gives them glee when they can beat the Americans in basketball especially. They have a lot of players in the NBA now from that region and from Serbia. So they're still very attached to the West, but they will never forget what they perceived was a wrong perception the West had about Serbia. And they will never forget the years when they were being bombed, when they were being vilified. It's hard for them to overcome that totally, even though they've moved on as a modern country, and Belgrade, a very nice, upscale city. But it's hard for them to really move past their past. So there is still that dichotomy there. There's that undercurrent there. Even when they see that American passport, you can almost tell sometimes, even though they're not overt about it typically. And I still have very good friends there who I respect a great deal and they respect me. But you can tell sometimes, in almost a whimsical way, that they are still unsure about how they feel, about their own history and their own worldview. Now, that's not to say that they're ambivalent. That's not the case. They're very opinionated and they're very locked into their beliefs about Serbian nationalism. So I don't mean that. There's no dichotomy there. But I think the dichotomy is that they really want to be perceived by the world in a different way than they've been perceived in the past. And that's a challenge for them because even now in Bosnia, the Republika Srpska is heavily supported by the Serbian government. It's creating instability in the region. So geopolitically, there are still all types of issues that all the countries in the former Yugoslavia, but especially Serbia, being the largest one, is having to deal with. It was categorized while I was there by someone in Bosnia as that Serbia is the bully on the block. And they were certainly perceived that way in the 1990s. I don't believe that most Serbs want to be perceived that way. And I believe that if you go there today as an American or a Canadian or whatever nationality you are listening to this podcast, that you will find it to be an interesting and profoundly intriguing country filled with people who genuinely are glad that you're there and want to share their history and culture with you. So don't get the perception, because of all the things that happened in the 1990s, that the Serbs are people to be feared or that they are intolerant of others. But you need to understand that respecting their history and their culture and their worldview is critical to being able to build relationships with the Serbs. So I'm going to stop right there today. We're going to continue to take a stroll, if you will, through the Balkans as we move forward and some stops along the way. But I just wanted to share my observations today with you on Kosovo and Serbia and highlight a little bit of their history, culture, and geopolitics. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Some Stops Along the Way, and that you'll go on Amazon.com and grab your copy of my memoirs of the same name. Until next time, this is Mark McCord signing off. Have a great, great day.